The pain hit me first, sharp hot radiating from the incision below my navel, and then I heard him say it standing in our bedroom doorway like he was reading off a grocery list. This Sunday all 10 of them are staying here. 2 weeks. I actually laughed thinking it was a joke until I saw his face. He wasn't joking. I'd had surgery 4 days ago. I could barely climb the stairs without gripping the railing until my knuckles went white, and my husband was telling me our house was about to become a hotel for his entire family. I want to explain who I am because it matters. My name is Emma Walker. I'm 42 years old, a major in the United States Army, and 3 weeks ago I was pulling a 19-year-old private out of a rollover during a training exercise when something in my abdomen gave way. Laparoscopic surgery followed, not catastrophic, the surgeon told me, but not nothing either. Internal repair. 2 weeks minimum of rest. No lifting, no prolonged standing, no stress on the abdominal wall. I had the discharge papers sitting right there on the kitchen counter next to a bottle of prescription painkillers I hadn't wanted to take because they made my thoughts go foggy, and I needed my thoughts sharp for this conversation. "Daniel," I said, keeping my voice level the way I'd learned to keep it level in briefings where everything was falling apart around me. "I just had surgery, you know that. I was in the hospital 5 days ago." "I know," he said, not looking at me, already scrolling through something on his phone. "The doctor said no housework, no cooking for a crowd, no stairs more than necessary. We don't even have enough bedrooms for 10 people, Daniel. Where would everyone sleep? We'll figure it out. Ron and Margaret can take our room, we'll take the guest room, the kids can do sleeping bags in the basement." He said it so easily, like he'd already mapped the whole thing out in his head days ago, like my recovery had never once entered the equation. "Can we push it back a week, just 1 week, so I have time to—" "No one's changing their plans for you, Emma." The words landed somewhere lower than my stomach. Not in an especially cruel tone that was almost the worst part. He said it the way you'd tell someone the mail was late, flat, final, like my body, my recovery, my actual physical safety was a scheduling inconvenience he'd already decided to override. I didn't say anything else that night. There's a particular kind of silence that settles over you when you finally see something you'd spent years refusing to see. And that's the silence I sat in, alone at the kitchen table, staring at the discharge papers under the flickering light above the stove. 14 years of marriage. 14 years of putting his family first, his schedule first, his comfort first, telling myself that's just how it is, that's just Daniel, that's just his mother. I'd built an entire private philosophy around excusing it. But there's a difference between being overlooked and being told explicitly to your face 4 days after abdominal surgery that your health doesn't rank high enough to delay a family visit by 7 days. I called my doctor's office the next morning. Not to ask permission, I already knew the answer, but because some part of me needed to hear it from someone whose entire job was to protect me, since apparently that job had an opening at home. "Dr. Reyes, if I have 10 additional people in the house for 2 weeks and I'm expected to cook, clean, do laundry, manage bedding, what happens?" She didn't hesitate. "Emma, I need to be direct with you. Your repair is still fresh. Any strain like that risks reopening the incision internally, which could mean a second surgery, possibly worse than the first. I'm putting this in your chart as a formal restriction. No lifting over 10 pounds, no extended standing, no domestic labor beyond the absolute minimum for a full 14 days. I thanked her, and I meant it because something about hearing it in clinical language restriction formal chart made it real in a way that arguing with Daniel in our kitchen hadn't. This wasn't me being sensitive. This wasn't me exaggerating a normal recovery. This was a documented medical order, and my husband had heard it from my own mouth and decided it didn't outrank his mother's travel plans. I went upstairs slowly, one hand against the wall, and I sat on the edge of our bed for a long time without turning on the light. I thought about deployments, about the nights I'd spent overseas trusting the person next to me with my life because that's what the job demanded, absolute, unconditional reliability. I thought about the promise I'd made walking down the aisle, the one where he'd promised something similar, in sickness and in health. I wondered when exactly he'd quietly amended that promise, and whether he even remembered making it. I didn't cry. I want to be honest about that because I think people expect tears at this point in the story, and there weren't any. What I felt instead was quieter and colder than tears, something settling into place, like a lock clicking shut. I thought about all the small moments over the years I'd forgiven, absorbed, explained away. I thought about Sunday 3 days from now and the sound of car doors slamming in my driveway. And somewhere in that stillness, a different thought arrived, one I hadn't let myself think in 14 years of marriage. Maybe this time I won't let it go. Sunday arrived with the kind of bright, cheerful sunlight that felt almost mocking. By 10 in the morning, 3 SUVs were parked crooked across my driveway, doors flung open, and what followed looked less like a family visit and more like an occupation. Suitcases, coolers, a dog crate. Margaret's youngest son wheeling in a portable crib like he was moving into a rental property rather than staying as a guest in someone else's home. Not one person asked how I was feeling, not one. Margaret came through the front door first, sweeping past me in the entryway without so much as a glance at the incision I was still favoring with one arm, pressed protectively against my side. She looked me over the way you'd look over furniture that needed rearranging and said, "Well, you've had enough time lying around. Let's get this house organized." Before I could respond, she was already dispensing assignments like a general briefing troops. Someone needed to start dinner for 12. The guest linens needed washing, all of them twice, because you never know how long they've been sitting. The upstairs bedrooms needed to be cleared out and reorganized so the grandchildren could share space properly. Daniel stood a few feet away saying nothing, not defending me, not even meeting my eyes. "Margaret," I said, keeping my tone even, "I actually can't do any of that. My doctor's been very clear, no cooking for a crowd, no lifting, no extended time on my feet. I had surgery less than a week ago." She waved a hand already halfway to the kitchen. "Please, I had 4 children and I was up cooking and cleaning within days each time. Women today act like childbirth is some kind of national emergency." A ripple of laughter moved through the room, her sister-in-law, a couple of the older grandkids, even Ron chuckling under his breath from his recliner. Nobody corrected her. Nobody mentioned that I hadn't given birth. I'd had internal surgical repair after a training injury. An entirely different kind of trauma to an entirely different part of my body. But details like that apparently didn't matter once the joke was already landing. I didn't argue. I've learned over years of higher stakes situations than a crowded kitchen that arguing with people who've already decided not to hear you is a waste of oxygen. Instead, I walked upstairs slowly, one measured step at a time, my hand trailing the banister, and I retrieved my post-operative instructions from the folder on my nightstand. I took a photo of the page where Dr. Reyes had written in her own handwriting, "No lifting, no extended domestic labor, 14 days minimum." I sent it to Daniel with no caption, just the image. He read it. I watched the message go from delivered to read right there on my screen. He didn't reply. Didn't come upstairs, didn't say a word about it for the rest of the night. By evening, the house had transformed into something I barely recognized as my own. Coats piled on my reading chair. Children's toys scattered across the living room floor I'd swept myself only 2 days before. Someone had rearranged the pantry without asking, and someone else had used my good pot, the enameled one I'd bought myself after my last promotion, to boil pasta for the kids, leaving it soaking with burnt residue in the sink. Small things. None of them catastrophic on their own, but each one landed like another small stone placed on a scale that had already tipped. I tried to rest that evening, retreating to the bedroom for 20 minutes with the door mostly closed, only to have Margaret knock and inform me not ask that dinner needed serving in 10 minutes, and could I please come help set the table since everyone else is busy. I set the table. I told myself it was one meal one night and things would settle once everyone got comfortable. I have a bad habit, I think, of extending grace to people who've given me no evidence they deserve it, simply because extending grace is less exhausting than confrontation. That night, though, standing at the table with plates in each hand, feeling a small sharp pull low in my abdomen that made me catch my breath, I understood I was lying to myself. This wasn't going to settle. This was the baseline. This was what 2 weeks would look like magnified. Daniel found me in the kitchen afterward, rinsing dishes I shouldn't have been lifting. He didn't ask if I needed help. He asked if I'd seen where his mother's suitcase had ended up. I went to bed that night in more pain than I let anyone see. The muscles around my incision ached from the twisting, reaching, bending I'd done all day, despite every instruction telling me not to. I lay in the dark, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of a house too full, Someone's television down the hall, a baby fussing footsteps on stairs I'd been told not to climb myself. I reached for the pain medication I'd been avoiding, and took it finally, because the alternative was lying there rigid with pain until morning, and no one in that house would have noticed either way. I didn't tell Daniel how bad it had gotten. I didn't tell anyone. I just lay there in the dark, one hand resting lightly over the bandage beneath my shirt, and thought about how quiet a house can feel, even when it's full of people if not one of them is truly looking at you. By the second day, something in the house had shifted, and not in my favor. What had started as thoughtless inconvenience curdled into something closer to expectation. As if my body, my recovery, my presence in my own home had become resources for the family to draw on freely without so much as a thank you. It started small. Someone needed laundry done, and somehow that someone became me standing at the machine sorting whites from colors, while my sister-in-law sat scrolling her phone on the couch not 10 feet away. Then it was the kitchen dishes piling up after every meal, and Margaret announcing without looking up from her crossword that someone should handle it before it got out of hand, her eyes flicking pointedly in my direction. Then it was the children. 2 of the younger grandkids got parked in front of me for an entire afternoon while their parents ran errands, and I found myself chasing a toddler around furniture I wasn't supposed to be bending near my abdomen, screaming with every quick movement I had to make to keep him from the stairs. The moment that actually stopped me, though, was smaller than all of that, and somehow it cut deeper. I went looking for my ice pack, the one Dr. Reyes had specifically prescribed for post-operative swelling, kept in a designated spot in the downstairs bathroom cabinet, and found the cabinet half emptied. My youngest sister-in-law had gone through it looking for a headache remedy, and had simply taken the ice pack too, using it for her own sore shoulder from the drive, leaving it damp and half melted on the guest room dresser. When I mentioned it gently, just asking that people leave my medical supplies alone, Margaret was the one who answered, arms crossed, voice sharp. "Don't be so selfish, Emma. It's ice. We're family." I didn't argue. I picked up the ruined ice pack and went back to the kitchen, and something in my chest went very still and very quiet, the way it used to right before a difficult call in the field. That particular calm that isn't peace. It's just the absence of panic clearing space for whatever needs to happen next. That afternoon, while helping clear plates, I'd been explicitly told not to lift. I felt something give. Not dramatic. No sudden collapse. No scream. Just a warm, wrong sensation, low against my abdomen, followed by a sharper pain than anything I'd felt since the surgery itself. I excused myself and went to the bathroom, and when I lifted my shirt in front of the mirror, I saw a small, dark patch spreading against the bandage. Blood. Not a lot, but blood where there shouldn't have been any. 5 days after a surgery I'd been told to protect at all costs. I drove myself to the urgent care clinic. I didn't ask Daniel to come. I'm not entirely sure why. Maybe some part of me already knew what his answer would look like, some mixture of distraction and mild irritation about the timing, and I didn't have the energy that day to watch him choose his family over me one more time. Dr. Patterson, the physician on duty, examined the incision with careful hands and a face that grew more serious the longer she looked. "This is early-stage dehiscence risk," she told me. "The site is under strain it shouldn't be under. If this continues, if you keep doing physical labor lifting, prolonged standing, there's a real possibility the internal repair fails entirely. That would mean emergency surgery and a recovery timeline significantly longer and more dangerous than this one." She wrote it all down, formally. In the chart, in careful clinical language, the kind of documentation that exists, precisely because sometimes verbal warnings aren't enough. Sometimes people need something undeniable in writing. Before I left, she looked at me directly and said something I've turned over in my mind many times since. "Emma, if there's pressure at home causing this, if someone is making you do things you've told them you can't do, that needs to stop immediately. Your body isn't negotiable here." I thanked her and drove home in silence, the radio off my hands, steady on the wheel, even though something inside me had started shifting in a direction I didn't yet have words for. That night I did something I'd never done before in 14 years of marriage. I got out the small notebook I kept for work notes, the same kind I'd used for years, to document briefings, incidents, anything that might later require an accurate record. And I started writing down what had actually happened. Dates. Specific tasks I'd been assigned despite medical restriction. The ice pack, the dehiscence risk, Daniel's silence when I'd sent him the photo of my discharge instructions. I wrote without anger the way you write an after-action report, just facts laid out plainly one after another. I don't think I fully understood that first night writing in the notebook exactly what I was building toward. I only knew that something in me had finished waiting to be noticed, finished hoping that if I explained clearly enough, calmly enough, someone in that house would finally see me. I closed the notebook, turned off the lamp, and lay there in the dark, with my hand resting over the fresh dressing Dr. Patterson had applied, listening to laughter drifting up from downstairs, where my family, Daniel's family, carried on as if nothing at all had happened that day. I woke up the next morning with a clarity I hadn't felt in years. Not anger exactly. Anger is loud, and this was quiet, almost surgical in its precision. I made coffee before anyone else was awake, sat alone at the kitchen table in the gray, early light, and made a phone call that would change everything, though nobody in that house had any idea yet. There's something about this house I haven't mentioned, something almost none of Daniel's family knows, something I'd never seen a reason to bring up because it never seemed to matter. I bought this house 6 years before Daniel and I married. Cash, most of it from a combination of my Army salary, careful saving, and a small inheritance from my grandmother who'd taught me early that financial independence wasn't optional for a woman who intended to take care of herself. When Daniel and I married, I never changed the deed. Not out of distrust exactly, more habit, more the quiet instinct of someone who'd learned in the military to always keep at least one thing entirely her own. He moved in. I welcomed him fully into our life together. But the house on paper, in every legal sense, had only ever belonged to me. I called Hartwell Property Management, a firm I'd used years earlier when I'd briefly rented out a condo during an overseas deployment. I explained the situation to the woman on the line, calmly, factually, the way I'd learned to communicate difficult things without letting emotion distort the message. I told her I needed a formal notice issued to current occupants of my property, effective immediately, citing the owner's medical necessity and right to control use of her own residence. She didn't ask many questions. That's the thing about professionals. They don't need your whole emotional history, just the facts required to do their job. She confirmed the property details, verified my ownership documentation, which I emailed over within the hour, and scheduled a team to arrive at the house the following morning at 9 to deliver notice in person. I sat with that decision for a long moment after hanging up, waiting to feel something like guilt or doubt. It didn't come. What came instead was something closer to relief, the specific relief of finally acting instead of enduring, of choosing instead of simply absorbing whatever was placed on me. I didn't tell Daniel. I want to be honest about why. Some part of me knew that if I told him, he'd find a way to talk me out of it, to soften it, to protect his mother's feelings at the expense of my own recovery one more time, the way he'd done every single day since Sunday. I'd given him countless opportunities to choose me over convenience, the conversation before they arrived, the photo of my discharge papers, the quiet request about the ice pack, my own visible pain that any attentive husband would have noticed without needing to be told. He'd had chances. He hadn't taken any of them. I spent the rest of that day moving through the house, almost like a stranger observing it. I watched Margaret direct my sister-in-law on how to properly fold towels in my linen closet. I watched Daniel's brother track mud across floors I'd mopped myself just 3 days before the surgery. I watched the children play games that scattered toys through every downstairs room, no one bothering to teach them to pick anything up. I watched all of it with a strange, settled calm, because for the first time since Sunday, I knew something none of them did. I knew that tomorrow all of this ended. That evening, Daniel tried in his limited way to smooth things over. He brought me a cup of tea I hadn't asked for and sat across from me at the kitchen table, and for a moment I almost let myself hope he'd finally noticed something was wrong beyond the surface. "Everyone's having a good time," he said, instead missing the point so completely it almost would have been funny under different circumstances. "Mom seems happy." "I'm glad someone is," I said, and if there was an edge in my voice, he didn't catch it. He never seemed to catch it anymore, that particular frequency where my exhaustion lived. I went to bed early that night, earlier than I had all week, not because I was more tired than usual, but because I wanted to be well rested for the morning, for what was coming. I lay in the dark, running through it in my mind the way I used to run through operational plans before a difficult mission, not from anxiety, but from the disciplined habit of anticipating every possible response, and knowing exactly how I intended to hold my ground regardless of what came at me. I thought about the notebook downstairs in my bag filled now with dates and details, and a photograph of a stained ice pack. I thought about Dr. Patterson's warning about dehiscence, about the formal medical restriction sitting in my chart in black and white. I thought about 14 years of small compromises that had led somehow to this exact moment, a woman recovering from surgery lying awake in her own bed, planning to reclaim a house that had been legally hers all along. Tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock someone would knock on the door, and for the first time since Sunday it wouldn't be me answering to everyone else's demands. It would be everyone else finally answering to mine. The knock came at exactly 9 o'clock, sharp and businesslike nothing, like the casual chaos that had filled this house all week. I was already dressed, already seated at the kitchen table with my coffee when I heard Margaret's footsteps hurry toward the door, probably assuming it was a delivery or a neighbor. 2 representatives from Hartwell stood on the porch, professional and unhurried, folders in hand. I watched from the kitchen as the older one, a woman named Carol, introduced herself and asked politely but firmly to speak with the property owner regarding a matter of residency. "I'm sure there's some mistake," Margaret said, already trying to close the door slightly as if that might make the interruption disappear. "This is my son's house." "Actually," Carol said, glancing down at her folder, "our records show the property is solely owned by an Emma Walker. We're here on her behalf." I stood up then, slow but steady, and walked into the entryway. Every eye in the kitchen and living room turned toward me at once, Daniel halfway through pouring cereal for one of the kids, Ron in his recliner lowering the newspaper, Margaret's face shifting from confusion to something sharper. "Good morning," I said to Carol, keeping my voice even. "Thank you for coming." Carol nodded and continued addressing the room now rather than just Margaret. "Per the property owner's instructions, all current occupants are asked to vacate the premises by 5 o'clock this evening. This is a formal notice regarding use of the residence issued at the request of Mrs. Walker, citing medical necessity." The kitchen went silent in a way I hadn't heard all week. Then Margaret's voice cut through it, high and furious. "This is absurd! Daniel, tell them this is your house too." Daniel stood frozen for a moment, cereal box still in his hand, looking between his mother and me like he genuinely couldn't process what was happening. "Emma," he finally said, setting the box down hard enough that milk sloshed over the counter. "What is this? You can't just— this is my family." "I know exactly whose family it is," I said. "I've known all week." "You can't kick out my mother," he said, his voice rising now, something close to disbelief mixed with real anger. "I'm your husband." "You are," I agreed. "And I'm the owner of this house. Those are 2 different facts, Daniel, and this week you've only chosen to acknowledge one of them." I went to the small drawer in the hallway console where I kept important documents, and I pulled out the deed, the original with my name on it, dated 6 years before our wedding. I laid it on the kitchen table in front of everyone next to the abandoned cereal bowl and let it speak for itself. Emma R. Walker, sole owner. Margaret snatched it up, scanning it like she expected to find some error, some technicality that would unravel what was written plainly in front of her. She didn't find one because there wasn't one to find. Her face went through several colors before settling on something pale and furious. "You never told us this was your house," she said, like the omission itself was the crime rather than everything that had happened because of it. "You never asked," I said. "No one in this family has asked me a single question about myself in 14 years that wasn't about what I could do for someone else." Ron, who'd stayed quiet through most of this, finally set his newspaper down completely and looked at me for a long moment. "Emma," he said slowly, did we push you into something you weren't able to do physically?" "I told you I'd just had surgery," I said, keeping my voice level even as something tightened in my chest, some old habit of softening things for other people's comfort, trying to reassert itself. "I told your wife specifically. I showed Daniel my discharge instructions. I went back to urgent care 2 days ago because the incision started reopening from strain. I have documentation. I have a notebook with dates." This wasn't sudden, Ron. This was a week of being told in various ways that my recovery mattered less than everyone's comfort. Ron looked at Daniel then, and something passed between father and son that I couldn't fully read, though Daniel's face had gone the color of the discharge papers still sitting on the counter where I'd left them days ago. "You never mentioned any of this to me," he said quietly to Daniel. "She's exaggerating," Margaret snapped, though her voice had lost some of its earlier certainty. "I'm not," I said. "Everything Carol just told you, I already told my husband in writing 5 days ago. He read it and never responded." The room stayed quiet after that, the kind of silence where people are recalculating everything they thought they understood about the past several days. Carol, patient throughout, gently reminded everyone about the 5 o'clock deadline and left contact information for the property management office, then stepped back outside to give the family privacy. Though privacy felt like exactly the wrong word for what was unraveling in that kitchen. I stood there in my own entryway, in my own house, watching my husband's family absorb a truth that had been sitting in a filing cabinet the entire time available to anyone who'd simply thought to ask. I felt none of the guilt I might have expected. What I felt instead was something closer to standing at attention, straight-backed, steady, finally occupying the space that had always technically belonged to me. The house emptied in stages that afternoon, not all at once, but in a slow, humiliated procession, suitcases dragged back to the SUVs, the portable crib disassembled with far more speed than it had been set up. Voices low and clipped instead of the easy laughter that had filled the rooms all week. Nobody said goodbye to me directly. A few of them managed a tight nod on their way out the door, but most simply avoided my eyes entirely, as if eye contact might require some acknowledgement they weren't prepared to make. Daniel didn't leave. He stood in the kitchen long after the last car pulled out of the driveway, staring at the deed still lying on the table where I'd left it, like the paper itself might rearrange its words if he looked at it long enough. "I need you to explain this to me," he finally said. "All of it." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to anymore. I went to the hallway closet and pulled out the folder I'd assembled over the past week, without telling him the discharge instructions, the photo timestamp showing exactly when I'd sent it to him, Dr. Patterson's formal note about the dehiscence risk, even a printed copy of the text message I'd sent about the ice pack, the one he'd never responded to. I laid them out one by one on the table the way you'd lay out evidence, because at this point, that's precisely what it was. He went quiet as he read through each page. I watched something shift in his face as he reached Dr. Patterson's note. The clinical language spelling out in plain terms what could have happened if the strain had continued, the real physical danger I'd been living inside for a week while he'd been refilling drinks for his brothers and laughing at his mother's jokes about how women today exaggerate recovery. "I didn't know it got this serious," he said quietly. "You knew enough," I said. "You knew I'd had surgery. You knew what the doctor said before they even arrived. I told you directly in this kitchen 4 days before they showed up. Everything after that was just you choosing not to look closer." He sat down heavily in one of the kitchen chairs, elbows on his knees, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost the defensive edge from that morning. "Why didn't you just tell me how bad it had gotten? Why go straight to something like this instead of talking to me?" It was a fair question and I'd expected it, so I answered honestly. "I did talk to you, Daniel, multiple times, multiple ways. I talked to you with words, I talked to you with a photograph of my discharge papers. I talked to you by asking your mother gently to leave my medical supplies alone. Every single time you either said nothing or you told me essentially that my needs were less important than everyone else's comfort. At some point, talking stops being a strategy. It becomes just another way of being ignored." He absorbed that in silence, and I let him sit with it, because I'd spent 14 years rushing to fill silences with reassurance, softening hard truths, so he wouldn't feel bad, and I found I simply didn't have the energy for that particular habit anymore. "I want to ask you something," I said, and he looked up. "When I first told you about the surgery when I was still in the hospital bed, what was the very first thing you thought about?" He opened his mouth, then closed it again. I watched him actually try to remember, really search for it, and the longer the silence stretched, the more I understood that he couldn't answer because whatever he'd thought about hadn't been me. "I don't remember," he finally admitted, and something in his voice cracked slightly on the words, like he was hearing the answer for the first time himself, and didn't like what it revealed. "I remember," I said quietly. "I remember exactly what I thought lying in that hospital bed. I thought about how relieved I was that you'd be there when I woke up from anesthesia. I thought I was lucky to have a husband who'd drop everything for me. I believed that Daniel. Right up until Sunday, I actually believed that about you." Ron came back later that evening alone without Margaret. He knocked softly and asked if he could speak with me for a few minutes. I let him in curious, despite everything, and we sat in the living room while Daniel remained upstairs, still absorbing the weight of the folder I'd shown him. "I owe you an apology," Ron said, turning his hat over in his hands the way older men sometimes do when they're uncomfortable. "I should have asked more questions this week. I noticed you moving slowly, favoring your side, but I told myself it wasn't my business. That was a failure on my part." "Thank you for saying that," I said, and I meant it, because it was the first genuine acknowledgement I'd received from anyone in that family all week. "Margaret's not going to apologize," he added with a kind of tired honesty. "That's not who she is, but I want you to know what happened here wasn't right. You deserved better than what this family gave you, and especially better than what my son gave you." He left not long after that, and the house fell into a different kind of quiet than it had held all week, not the tense, overcrowded silence of people avoiding conflict, but something calmer, emptier, more honest. Daniel came downstairs eventually and sat across from me again, and this time instead of defending himself, he simply said, "I don't know how to fix this." "I don't know either," I told him honestly, "but I know it starts with you actually seeing me, not just hearing me." A month passed before Daniel and I sat down together again with any real intention of talking things through. My incision had healed properly by then, the internal repair holding steady under the careful, uneventful recovery I'd finally been allowed to have once the house emptied out and I could rest without negotiating for the right to do so. Physically, I was myself again. Emotionally, something had shifted in a way that wasn't going to quietly settle back into its old shape. Daniel reached out first, asking if we could meet for coffee somewhere neutral away from the house, away from the weight of everything that had happened inside it. I agreed mostly out of respect for 14 years that deserved an honest conversation rather than a silent unraveling. We sat across from each other at a small table by the window, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, he didn't try to explain himself before actually listening. He told me he'd spent the month thinking about that question I'd asked him in the kitchen. What was the first thing he'd thought about when I told him about the surgery, and that not being able to answer it had bothered him more than almost anything else that week. He said he'd started to realize that somewhere over the years he'd stopped actually seeing me as a person with needs of my own, and had started seeing me instead as a kind of steady background structure. Someone who simply handled things, who didn't require the same attention or protection he extended so easily to his own family. "I'm not asking you to forgive everything today," he said. "I just want you to know I understand now, even if it's too late to matter." "It's not nothing," I told him honestly. "I do forgive you, Daniel. I forgive the thoughtlessness, even the silence. I understand people can be blind to things without meaning real harm by it." I paused, choosing my next words carefully, because they mattered more than anything else I'd say that day. "But forgiving you doesn't mean going back to living inside that blindness. I can't build my life around hoping you'll eventually notice me when it counts. I need to know it, not hope for it." He nodded slowly, and I watched him absorb that answer without arguing against it, which itself felt like a small, quiet kind of growth. We didn't resolve everything at that table. Some things I've learned aren't meant to be resolved in a single conversation, no matter how honest. But we agreed to keep talking carefully without pretending. The month before hadn't happened without smoothing over what it had cost. What I understood most clearly sitting there with my coffee going cold between us was something that had nothing to do with dramatic gestures or legal deeds or notices delivered by property managers. What actually breaks a marriage isn't one explosive argument, one dramatic betrayal you can point to and say that's where it ended. It's smaller than that and slower. It's the accumulation of moments where the person who's supposed to protect you chooses again and again not to look closely enough to notice you're struggling, It's someone you love asking for rescue plainly, clearly in words and photographs and quiet requests, and watching that person choose comfort over you instead. 2 weeks after that conversation, I returned to my unit. I stood in front of the mirror that morning, fastening the last buttons of my uniform, the gold oak leaf on my collar catching the early light, and I felt something settle inside me that had been unsettled for a long time. In the Army, we're trained from day one on a principle that governs everything else: you never leave someone behind. Not in the field, not under fire, not when things get difficult and it would be easier to keep moving without them. It's not a suggestion. It's the foundation everything else is built on. It struck me driving to base that morning that the person who'd once promised to build a life with me under nearly identical terms, for better or worse in sickness and in health, had been the one to leave me behind when it mattered most. Not through some singular act of cruelty, but through 100 small moments of choosing not to look. I don't know yet exactly where Daniel and I end up. Some mornings I think we'll find our way back to something real and rebuilt. Other mornings I'm not so sure, and I've made peace with that uncertainty in a way I couldn't have a month ago. What I do know is that I'll never again mistake silence for safety, or explain away being unseen as simply the price of loving someone. I know my own worth now in a way I hadn't fully claimed before that week, and that knowledge isn't something anyone can take from me again, regardless of how this next chapter unfolds. If you've made it this far with me, I'd love to know what you think happens next for Emma and Daniel. Do you believe some marriages can genuinely rebuild after a wound like this? Or do certain moments reveal something too fundamental to undo? Leave a comment below and tell me where in the world you're watching from tonight. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. We share powerful, true-to-life stories like this every single day, so if this one moved you, please consider subscribing so you never miss the next one. Thank you for walking through this journey with me. Let's keep going together.